Alrighty, it is now the beginning of May, and I've just finished reading Yann Martel's Life of Pi. Really, I read this in two sittings. It's just that I fell asleep during the second sitting because I'm very tired. I'm still very tired. But, yeah. So, Life of Pi is a fascinating dive into what does it really mean to have an unreliable narrator, because we throw out that term a lot when we talk about literature, but very rarely do we actively get to see the unreliability of it all, right? And sometimes the unreliability stems from trying to do the right thing, right? Because what we end up seeing here is we have this beautifully crafted story of survival and of outsmarting the world around us. But then at the very end, we get a 2-page description of what more realistically probably happened, right? And of course, because Pi is the only person who survived and the only person who really understands and knows what happened, well then, he's the one that gets to have and really understand what happened, right? And he's the one who gets to carry the story. And it's one of these things in which, right, we have this great question of which do we as people who have to live with those around us, which story would we rather have, right? Would we rather have this great, wonderful story of a young boy that has used the lessons that he has learned throughout his life up to this point to survive and to show the indomitable human spirit? Or would we rather have this story that is about the inherent greed and desire that exists when it comes to humans in survival situations, and recognize that humans inherently are still animals, right? That's one of the great questions here, right? Is which story would we rather know and understand and really come to terms with, right? This is the first time I've read Life of Pi. I've also not seen the movie. I've seen like clips of it, but I've never seen the full thing. So this is, what the story ends up being was very interesting to me, because for the most part, when I was reading through this, I basically got through halfway through the book. I had to chapter 50 in my first portion of reading this, and I was very, very, very convinced that this was a story and a metaphor for the religious world that was going around Pi at the time, in terms of India and its new reckoning and the movement of religious beliefs, not only in the world around him but also within Pi, right? Because you have these 4 different animals that are existing on the boat, and I would argue that they can all be representative of a different major faction of belief systems in Pi's world, right? You have the zebra, which I would relate to Hinduism, right? Herbivore, vegetarian, style, considered to be quiet, peaceful, docile, but willing to survive. You have the hyena, which I would relate to Islam, because of the perception that exists, right? We get at the very top of the book, right? The entire first, 10 chapters or whatever is focused on this religious aspect of Pi's life. And, the belief systems, and also how the belief systems are interpreted by those around him. And what we see is that Islam is a belief system that is considered by the characters to be a very violent and very selfish religion, right? And is that inherently the case? No, right? But that is the viewpoint of a lot of the people in the book that we meet at the very top, which then goes into how the hyena acts on the boat. You have the baboon, which I would argue is representative of what Pi calls the new India, is the very scientific, atheist lifestyle that exists, right? It's one of knowledge and reason and thought, but also very reactive to things, right? And then finally you have the Bengal tiger, which I would argue is representative of Christianity, because as described at the very top of the book, right, there's an understanding that Christianity is this very devouring and hungry religion that takes and is conquering in a way, but is also one that can be worked with and can be tamed and can be accepted, versus the other religions like the hyena and Islam, which is not considered to be a tameable religion in terms of what is set up at the top of the book, right? And then you have Pi, who is dealing with and wrestling with all of these different emotions and all of these different religions in his own life, while he's entering into the new world. And it's just one, really, that's what I thought this was going to go with, is this foundation of belief and faith, and how each one of these interact with each other, and then eventually comes down to Pi making a choice or decision on which religion or which thought system he believes in and identifies with the most, right? That's really where I thought this was going to go. What we learn at the very end, right, in the true story, or presumably the more likely story of all of it, is a story of heartbreak, right? Of which each character becomes representative of the animals, right? And really it becomes a story of Pi, right? As described in the survival manual, you need to keep your mind active. You need to create things with your mind while you're waiting at sea, because otherwise, right, your mind goes dull and you can't interact all that well anymore. So what he ends up doing is to try and make this situation better, and happier for himself, and also keep his mind active. He creates this story in which he inserts all of these people as animals that he's worked with at a zoo, right? And does his best to accommodate and reason and rationalize all of these actions and everything that has happened to both him and the other people on this boat, right? And what's really interesting is that he puts himself as the tiger, right? And it's a fascinating, interesting decision as to why that creature in particular, why Bengal tiger in particular. And I would argue it has a lot to do with this kind of sleeping, silent predator that exists within, right? Of where the cat, although very large, is very quick and very silent when it moves and when it hunts and when it stalks and when it preys and everything. And so, I would argue that that relates to Pi in a great deal, right? Because Pi is constantly just waiting. And then he only attacks and kills when it is his last option, right? So yeah, right. It's a very, very good book, right? I don't want to say fun, because inherently it's not supposed to be fun, but right, it's one of these really important things in which, right, sometimes the best stories are ones that have to be unbelievable. So yeah. The ending is, I think, really powerful and really important to note, right? It's when he's talking about how when he finally gets ashore, the tiger immediately runs off and doesn't say goodbye, and Pi goes on this deal in which he's talking about how it didn't upset him that the tiger left. It upset him that he didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye, right? Because it's one of those things, right, in which when we look at our life experiences, one of the important things is that we never really get to understand when things end, right? It's the whole thing of the good old times, right? And when we look back on them, we realize that was the good times, because we don't understand in the moment whether or not it was, right? And we don't understand when things actually end, right? So you put arbitrary movements and arbitrary pieces on things, right? And we attach them to certain random things. And so, right, this is one of the few times in which we have this very definitive moment in which Pi in his life gets to say, here's a specific date in which my life changed. And then here's the second specific date in which my life changed again when I got back to land. But in leading up to that, and at that moment, I never got to reconcile with what has just happened previously, right? And in the end, right, there's nothing that we can do except look back on things, right? Because we never understand when it is our time to say goodbye to things, right? That is Yann Martel's Life of Pi. Very good book, very, very fun book. Once again, I shouldn't say fun, very, very good book. But yeah.